Thanks to Headamp for sponsoring this review. Headamp are the makers of the legendary Blue Hawaii electrostatic headphone amplifier, as well as the Gilmore series of amps, including the new GSX Mini. They also sell the Audeze LCD-5, as well as some of the other products in this review. In the last few days, I've had numerous requests from Susvara owners as well as other people for a comparison with Audeze's LCD-5s. So the first logical thing one might do is to use an amplifier or system that can drive both headphones very well and compare them on that. And in that logical sense, it would be, in my setup, Chord's Hugo TT2, which has enough power out of the front sockets to drive the LCD-5s very well, and out of the rear XLR sockets has a very low output impedance, so it can drive even speakers well, which is sufficient for the HiFiMan Susvaras, considering they are close to something like equivalent to like a 60 ohm speaker, given that they only have a sensitivity of 83 decibels per milliwatt. And even the LCD-5s are still fairly insensitive at 90 decibels per milliwatt, making them somewhat hard to drive, and was certainly some trouble for portable amps to do that. Now, but what I thought is, really, if you are going to buy a pair of $4,500 headphones like the LCD-5s, or a pair of $6,000 headphones like the HiFiMan Susvaras, and please tell me you went to a dealer and negotiated a discount on that, then you are not just going to buy those and plug them into any old thing. You will probably have enough money to buy a good system to use them with, such as a good amplifier and a good digital to analog converter. So I don't recommend what some people are considering doing. Is someone contacted me who has a $200 amp and probably something equivalent in terms of a digital to analog converter, and then spending $4,500 on the headphones. Now, if your future goals, because you have a job and are saving up money, is to upgrade to a better system in the future, maybe that would be a consideration. But I would probably be more inclined, if you had $5,000 odd, to kind of split it somewhere closer to halfway. I'd probably be more inclined to buy a pair of LCDXs and then a good system to go with that. So with that thought in mind, I decided to run both headphones at their most optimum. And so the results are going to be a little bit different as compared to how they were in my reviews, actually, of both headphones. So in that case, I got out the good old Studio 6. Now, a few people asked me, where was that in the review? Well, actually, the Master 9 was there, and I didn't have space to put the Studio 6 in my rack at the time. And after a bit of a tube swap, I have that in place for use with the LCD-5s, and it has optimum output. It is a very overbuilt tube amp. It has 3 tubes for power rectification and 3 tubes, one for a gain stage and 2 for power output, some 6v6 GTs, which anyone who knows about guitar amps will be familiar with, and they provide headphone drive, and they provide a genuine 1 watt, or probably a bit over, of Class A drive for headphones. And they can actually even drive speakers. Actually, the adapter cable for using it with sensitive speakers, which I got from ALO Audio, I have readapted to use for plugging headphones into the other amp I'm going to use for the Susvaras. And this amp is one that somebody said is the best they'd ever heard the Susvaras out of, and that is Audio GD's Master 10 speaker amp. And I'm using that without any resistor boxes or anything in between, direct from that. And the reason I can do that is because not only does the Master 10 have a volume control, but also I'm using the volume control from the Chord TT2, which has a considerable output range. So in that, I'm using both of these at their optimum, and things were indeed a little bit different from how they were in the review. Now, if we go back to my review of the LCD-5s, I said that because of the different frequency response, the HiFiMan Susvaras, which have what I call a sort of listening neutral or slightly V-shaped sound, the music comes through as more left and right and less deep, and this was out of the TT2, whereas the LCD-5s have kind of a more mid-forward presence to them, and a kind of soundstage that's more like a circle. Now, putting them into separate amplifiers and running them at their optimum, things changed quite a bit. Not dramatically so, but enough to make a significant difference when listening. Now, that kind of mid-forward presentation of the LCD-5s was kind of a little bit grating sometimes on some music, and still is, especially if the music is clipping, because they are quite ruthless in how they show up in everything that's wrong in a recording and in equipment. But putting them through the Studio 6, which it's not a tubey sounding amp by any means, it is still an extremely fast amp, extremely understressed, but it provides maybe just a little bit of that harmonic, euphonic sound that just to take the edge off things, and it doesn't do so overtly. So tends to present the music in a very open and relaxed, but yet and actually extremely precise way. And that was just what the LCD-5s needed to kind of take the edge off that very mid-forward presentation that they have. On the other hand, the Susvaras, once you put them on a big speaker amp like the Master 10, suddenly that more left to right sound now has depth. And that made a significant difference, especially with things like people ask for, which is orchestral recordings, where you do want that to hear the depth that's in the music. Now, in both setups, especially with the Chord TT2 doing the digital to analog conversion, I could hear a lot of detail in the music and a lot out of both headphones about the imperfections in the recordings. Somebody asked about the instrument separation and detail. You want to be able to hear every fine detail in a classical recording, like each individual violin or each individual instrument in that. And that's one of the things the LCD-5s do exceptionally well, is that no matter how busy or complex the music gets, you can hear and you can pick out individual instruments and individual notes very clearly despite the music being complex. And that's something, say, the fairly similarly sounding LCD XCs, at least the 2021 version I have here, doesn't quite excel at as well as the LCD-5s do. Now, with the Susvaras, how that changed is with that slightly more V-shaped sound, is everything seemed to be big and expansive out of the Master 10. So it's like when you put on the headphones, the Susvaras became, and they can become very extremely exciting with certain amps, they became very open, relaxed, and clear. It's as if not just the amp disappeared, which is a characteristic of the high-end audio GD amps, but the headphones themselves seem to disappear mostly as well. You suddenly have this big, open, expansive space in which to listen, and yet there's no lack of dynamics in there at all. You had every little thing almost pinpoint in there. And every time I thought, maybe they aren't quite as pinpoint as the LCD-5s, I switched back to the LCD-5s and listened and found that actually it was the recording that had some issues. For example, Horowitz in Moscow, which is one of my favorite recordings, was one of the last recordings Horowitz ever made before he died. And because he had nothing to prove, he had less worries than he usually has when performing music, he was much more relaxed and much more free in what he did. And the way he plays is absolutely wonderful. To me, that recording, for example, I preferred listening with the Susvaras, where it felt like I could actually go into the music a little bit more and feel the passion for playing. Whereas the LCD-5s, with their kind of slightly more, flatter / mid-forward sound, seemed to be a little bit too analytical for me and seemed to detract maybe very slightly. But it could also be the fact that I listened to them second rather than first. Maybe if the situation was reversed, I might have felt differently. But it was much the same kind of thing with different recordings, whether it be jazz, which I listened to a lot, or something like Friday Night in San Francisco. The LCD-5s, maybe with that particular flat targeted tuning, tend to be a touch more analytical, though they had plenty of moments where with various tracks that I felt that kind of balance worked very, very well, especially with the extremely high quality bass. Now, of course, the Susvaras out of a speaker amp will have much better bass than they will out of something less powerful. So it was even things like Massive Attack, kind of much of a muchness. Which do I prefer? Sometimes even with modern music, where you might think logically, the slight V shape of the Susvaras will work better. Sometimes actually I did prefer the LCD-5s, where somehow, maybe it's just simply the mastering, where the balance of bass and mid-range meant that the LCD-5s worked out better for expressing what was in that music. So in the end, it actually really comes down to recording. I didn't find that one or other, in the most optimum setup I could get them, sounded more or less detailed than the other. Both at their optimum are amazing headphones and give a fantastic listening experience. And like I said in my review, I wish I had the Chord Dave here, because that would make it even better. It's amazing how much the differences kind of lessened once I optimized both of them. I mean, of course, they had that. The Odyssey LCD-5 sounded, instead of being like vastly more mid-forward and having a different sound, they sounded like a bit more mid-forward and a bit different. And the Susvara sounded a little bit more spaced out. But it was interesting to me how the contrast in switching between both pairs of headphones was lessened, especially once I got both of the amps warmed up. So when I switched them on this morning and listened, and they'd only been on for 10-20 minutes, I went back to that feeling like I had in the Odyssey LCD-5 review, where it felt like the difference between the headphones was much more of a contrast, especially switching mid-track. Whereas once they warmed up for a few hours, I felt that that contrast disappeared, and because things had optimized. So that was a really interesting experience in that way between them. So I'd say, what's the reason for buying a pair of LCD5s if you have Susvaras? If you've optimized your system for Susvaras, probably maybe the same amps are going to drive the LCD5s fine. If you've got $4,500 burning a hole in your pocket, as some people who now have nice paying jobs do, they've been through the whole HiFi thing and have gone for the premium stuff and want more, I'd say go for it. I think it will present something a little bit different. Sometimes for certain music, you might find that the LCD5s are just that slight adjustment. It's sort of like, dare I say it, like when you have a pair of headphones and they're not quite right, and then you kind of want to you switch something like a cable and they're different to a different headphone cable. It's like, that's the edge. That's just what I wanted. Like I did with the Impedance, where it just required a slightly, what we might say, brighter cable, and it kind of nailed it. I think the LCD5s are a little bit like that. Sometimes I wanted just a little bit more treble, just that what the Susvaras had, that slightly, you want to hear the ding of like a triangle or a cymbal just a little bit more. And sometimes the LCD5 sounded like the treble, for me, at least with my ears, was a touch muted. And that's the kind of situation where I go, let me try a different headphone cable and see if it just pushes that little edge. And of course, or maybe just that EQ, you want to EQ in just, a decibel here or there, just to shift the things just a little tiny bit. And that's the way I felt with the LCD5s, and less so with the Susvaras. Maybe there's still, instead of being like on the lesser gear, very left and right, where the Susvaras where the LCD5s were very round, the Susvaras suddenly had more of an oval-shaped sound, which versus the LCD5s, which were more round. So the Susvaras were kind of out here, but closer up here, and the LCD5s were more of a clean circle of soundstage. So it was kind of a very fine thing once you get both of them optimized, which was more of a surprise. I expected it would enhance their sound, but it goes to show how system synergy can really make a system great.